Welcome back. Get comfortable, turn the lights down low, and let yourself relax. Tonight, I have 8 unsettling stories to help you drift off. Take a slow, deep breath, and we will begin. I have been renting the old Mercer house for 3 weeks before I noticed the wallpaper was changing. Not dramatically, not all at once, just a slow, patient shifting in the pattern along the upstairs hallway, where the faded blue flowers seemed to face a slightly different direction each morning. I told myself it was the light. I told myself the angles were simply different at different hours of the day. The house was old enough to forgive small strangeness, I thought. It settled at night with soft, groaning sounds, like something large turning over in a deep sleep. The radiators ticked. The floorboards near the landing held warmth long after the rest of the house had gone cold, and I would sometimes pause there on my way to bed, standing in that one small pocket of inexplicable heat, listening to nothing in particular. It was the smell that finally made something shift inside me. A faint sweetness, like dried flowers left in a closed room for years, that would appear at the end of the hallway each evening around 9. I began waiting for it without meaning to. I would sit at the kitchen table and notice when it arrived, drifting down the stairs so gently I was never quite sure when it had begun. One night, I walked to the end of the hallway and stood very still. The smell was close. The wallpaper flowers I noticed were all turned now, every single one, facing the door of the small room I had never bothered to open. I put my hand on the coal brass knob. I stood there for a long time. I went back downstairs, made tea I did not drink, and sat with every light on until morning came soft and gray through the windows. I have not touched that door since. Our next story. The first thing I noticed was the smell of pipe tobacco, faint and sweet, drifting through the upstairs hallway each evening around 9. I had moved into the Aldrin house in early November, drawn by its low rent and the way the afternoon light fell golden through the warped window panes. The rooms were generous and cold. The floorboards were the color of old honey, and they creaked with a particular voice, a long, low syllable, when I crossed from the kitchen to the sitting room. I told myself the tobacco smell was coming from somewhere outside. A neighbor, perhaps. A vent carrying something from another time in the walls. I told myself this for 2 weeks. Then I began to notice the chair. It was a wingback chair positioned near the front window, dark green and faded along the armrests where hands had rested for many years. Every morning, I found it turned slightly toward the fireplace. Not dramatically, just a few degrees, the way a person might shift in their seat to feel more comfortable. I started marking its position each night before bed, a small piece of tape on the floor at the base of one leg. By morning, it had moved. I did not try to catch what moved it. I'm not sure I wanted to. Instead, I began leaving the room exactly as I found it each morning, as if acknowledging something, as if making room. The tobacco smell became familiar after a while, almost comforting in a way I did not fully trust. On the last night I slept there, I woke just before 3 and lay very still in the dark. The house was quiet. The chair was facing the hallway, and the air near the doorway felt occupied, dense and close, the way a room feels after someone has just left it. Our next story. I moved into the house in late October, when the days were already short and the light came through the windows at a low, tired angle that made every room feel like late afternoon, even at noon. The first strange thing was the clock in the hallway. It had stopped working before I arrived, hands frozen at 2:15, and I left it that way because I liked the look of it. But one morning I came downstairs and found the hands had moved. Not far, just a few minutes. I told myself I had misremembered their position. I told myself that for a while. The second thing was harder to explain away. I began waking each night at the same hour, pulled out of sleep by a feeling I could not name. Not a sound exactly, more like the absence of one, a kind of held breath that seemed to belong to the house itself. I would lie still and listen to the dark, and eventually the feeling would loosen and I would drift back down. Then one night, I noticed the door to the back bedroom was open. I had kept it closed since I arrived. I did not like the room, though I could not have said why. It was just a room, small and plain, with a window that looked out onto the garden. I went to close it and stood for a moment in the doorway. The garden below was silver with frost and perfectly still. And there, at the center of the lawn, the grass was pressed flat in a wide, even circle, as though something had rested there for a very long time. I closed the door quietly and went back to bed. In the morning, the frost had melted, and I could not find the circle. Our next story. I found the photographs on a Tuesday, tucked inside the wall cavity when the plaster crumbled near the fireplace. Dozens of them, black and white, all showing the same empty hallway from the same angle. I assumed they were old, left behind by some previous occupant with a peculiar habit. I stacked them on the kitchen table and thought nothing more of them that night. But I started noticing the hallway more after that. The way the afternoon light moved through was strange, slower somehow, like the air in there was thicker than it had any right to be. I would pass through quickly on my way to the back rooms, and sometimes I would pause, certain something had shifted just behind me. When I turned, of course, there was nothing, only the faded wallpaper and the thin shadow of the coat rack leaning slightly to the left. A week later, I was sorting through the photographs again, and I noticed something I had missed before. In a small number of them, perhaps 5 or 6, the coat rack was not leaning. It stood perfectly straight. I checked the coat rack in the hallway. It leaned as it always had. I went back to the photographs and looked more carefully at the ones where it stood straight. The wallpaper in those images was the same pattern as what hung on my walls now. The same faded roses, the same water stain near the ceiling that I had been meaning to report to the landlord. Those photographs were not old at all. I had not figured out where they came from or who put them there. I still walk through the hallway every day. The coat rack still leans. The light still moves through it too slowly. And sometimes in the evening, I find myself wondering whether somewhere, in some quiet place I cannot see, someone is still taking pictures. Our next story. The mirror in the upstairs hallway had always been there, a tall and tarnished thing propped against the wall between 2 closed doors. I had walked past it every night for a month without giving it much thought. It was the kind of house that collected objects the way old houses do, quietly and without explanation. It was sometime in early December when I first noticed it felt wrong. I had come upstairs with a glass of water, the rest of the house dark and settled, and I stopped in front of the mirror the way you sometimes stop without meaning to. My reflection looked back at me. Ordinary, still, but the hallway behind me in the glass was different than the one I was standing in. The wallpaper in the reflection was a deeper shade, almost brown, and the light that fell across it came from a different angle entirely, as though the window in that version of the hallway faced a different direction. I turned around. The wallpaper behind me was pale green. The window was where it had always been. I told myself it was the tarnish on the glass, the way old silver warps and distorts. I went to bed and did not think about it again for several days. But I began to notice that my reflection was never quite where it should be. Not dramatically, not in any way I could easily prove. Just slightly late, the way a second hand hesitates before moving. Just slightly off, the way a word sounds wrong after you've said it too many times. I stopped walking past the mirror at night. I left the hallway light on instead. The light did not help. Whatever it was did not seem to need the dark. Our next story. I started noticing it the second week of November when the cold had settled into the walls and the radiators clicked and groaned all through the night. It was the doors, not slamming, nothing so dramatic as that. They simply drifted. I would leave a room, return, and find the door resting at a different angle than I had left it. A few degrees, sometimes more. I told myself the old house breathed with the temperature changes, expanding and contracting in ways that shifted frames and hinges. That made sense to me then, but by the third week I began paying closer attention. I started leaving interior doors in precise positions, a corner of the door aligned with a scratch in the floorboard, and checking them when I came back. Most mornings they had moved, always inward, always just slightly, as though something on the other side had pressed against them in the night and then thought better of it. The house was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. No settling sounds after midnight. No wind working through the gaps in the siding. Just a stillness that sat behind everything, thick and patient. I would lie in bed and stare at my bedroom door, which I always left open exactly halfway, and by morning it would be nearly closed. One night, I stayed awake past 2 in the morning watching it. The hallway beyond was dark and still, and for a long time, nothing changed. Then, slowly, so slowly I almost convinced myself I was imagining it, the door began to move. Just a few inches. The latch caught softly against the plate. I got up and opened it again. By morning it was closed. I had not been able to stop leaving it open. I'm not sure anymore what I'm hoping to prove. Our next story. The floorboards in the parlor always felt colder than the rest of the house. I had noticed it that first evening, standing barefoot on the dark oak boards while the moving boxes sat unopened around me. And I had told myself it was simply the age of the place, the way old houses breathe differently than new ones. But by the third week, I had started to map it. There was a patch near the north window, roughly the size of a doormat, where the cold was most concentrated. Not a draft, not the kind of chill that moves and changes with the wind outside. This cold was fixed and patient, sitting in that one spot like something resting. I began to avoid it without making a decision to do so. I simply found myself walking around that corner of the room, giving it a wide berth the way you might give space to a stranger whose stillness makes you uneasy. One evening in late November, I set a glass of water on the floor there, curious in the way people are curious when they do not fully want an answer. In the morning, the water had not frozen, but the glass was facing the opposite direction, as though it had been carefully, considerately turned by someone who had passed through in the night. I picked it up and washed it and did not put it down there again. The cold patch remained through winter and into the early days of spring, when everything else in the house softened and warmed. Sometimes in the evenings I sat nearby and read, and occasionally I had the quiet, unshakable feeling that something in that corner was doing the same, leaning just slightly toward the light. Our next story. I began keeping a small journal the winter I stayed at my grandmother's old house, mostly just to pass the quiet hours. The house had been empty for 11 years, and the family had asked me to sort through what remained before the estate sale. I thought it would take 2 weeks. It took longer than that. The first strange thing was the window in the back bedroom. Every morning, without fail, I would find it open exactly 1 inch, the curtain moving softly in the cold air. I would close it each night, press the latch firmly, and test it with both hands. By morning, it was open again. I told myself the frame had warped with age, that it does strange things in old houses. I almost believed it. Then I noticed the journal entries I had already written were changing. Not dramatically, not in ways I could easily point to, but I would read something back and feel certain I had written it differently. A word I would never use. A phrase that felt like someone else's voice pressed into my own handwriting. I stopped writing for a few days. The house felt quieter after that, in a way that was harder to explain than the noise had been. A stillness that seemed to be waiting for something. On the last night before I left, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea going cold in my hands. The light over the table hummed faintly. I had this slow, certain feeling that something in the house had been reading along with me all those weeks, quietly and patiently, the way you might follow a story you already know the ending to. I left the journal on the kitchen table when I went. I do not feel right about taking it with me. That is all for tonight. Thank you for listening. Rest easy and sleep well.